For those presenting today, please turn your mic on when you begin speaking and off when you've completed your remarks. And for all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. So we have one briefing and work session today on our adult sheltering system and a report that was created for the board. So I'm really proud of how Multnomah County and our Homeless Services Department has taken a data-driven approach to understanding and reducing homelessness. From the release of the population data dashboard last April to this shelter assessment today, I'm confident that our work will help us to respond to the crisis on our street with best practices that increase outflow. And I will say that this is especially important as we face financial constraints. This analysis of 24/7 shelters provides a foundation for us to explore effective and efficient programs as we work on our FY27 budget that deliver results. So with that, I will invite Anna and Doc up here to present the highlights of the report, which is going to inform a discussion that we will have afterwards, and that part will be led by Commissioner Singleton as we move into the work session part. So with that, good morning to both of you. Thank you for being here today.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Anna Plum, and I am the Interim Director for the Homeless Services Department. I am joined by Doc Ramblings, our Senior Research and Evaluation Analyst, who will be doing the majority of the presenting today. We are really excited to be presenting to you our DOC's review of the 24/7 adult sheltering system in fiscal year 2025. Next slide, please. So I want to speak briefly to the goals of this presentation and the methods that we used. This was an HRAP action item, so we are checking off an action item with this report and presentation. But the reason it was an action item is that we knew that it would be important for us to have a better understanding of the cost and performance of our housing-focused shelter programs and understand how housing placement funds impact the performance of those shelters. We know that we are going into a significant resource constraint next fiscal year, and sheltering makes up a significant portion of our budget, and it's a significant intervention that we use to help people get safe off the streets and then hopefully end their homelessness via housing. This is a major intervention, it's a major program for our community, and so it's important that we understand how those programs are working, what they cost, and how they play a role in our larger homeless services continuum. So the goal of the report is to understand at a level of detail we haven't had in the past, specifically at the type but also program level, what's happening with our shelters, which will improve transparency and give us what we need for decision making as we move into a new budget year in fiscal year 2027. This analysis was done by a variety of data sources. We used quantitative analysis of both HMIS and cost data. HMIS, again, stands for Homelessness Management Information System. This is how we know who's being served in our shelters, the housing placement exits. There are a variety of all the sort of performance data and who is being served comes from Homelessness Management Information System. We also have detailed cost information for the shelters that are in our study. Essentially, we have our own cost data, but this review did also align with a state request for shelters to provide robust cost information to the state as they're looking at their own sheltering programs. That request went through our office, so we were lucky to use that information in our own cost analyses. We did also issue a survey to all the shelter providers included in the review, and I'll talk in a minute who those providers are and what the shelters are, asking about their strategies for housing, their barriers to housing, and other information. So DOC performed a qualitative analysis of that information, and we'll go through those themes. We do also have providers here to speak to that particular section. We will invite them up when we get to that section of the presentation, and we're very glad to have them here. Thank you. I do want to brag a little bit on Doc. This analysis was done by Doc. He is a senior research and evaluation analyst. He has significant expertise and is becoming a real expert on our shelter system. He did, however, work in discussion with many other folks. He worked with providers, he worked with our staff who are themselves experts in these programs, and he also worked with other jurisdictions, including the City of Portland, because we do include some of their programs in this review. So we really tried to make sure that we were working with them as we performed this review. Next slide, please. So what is in this report and what is not? This is a report that looks at housing-focused 24/7 shelters. So there are 31 programs included. This does not include the family, youth, or DSV shelters that the county runs. This is a look at adult shelter only. It does not include the city's overnight-only shelters, mainly because they were just not open long enough for us to have good enough data to really include them in this analysis. It includes shelters that are funded by the county or the city, at least partially, so it does not include shelters that we do not fund. Shelters had to be open for at least 6 months in FY 2025, so we could compare them to other programs. And also they needed to be in operation when the report was developed. So there are some shelters that had been open in 2025 but are now closed, and so those were not included, for example. To call out some things that are not included, we have a Rockwood Bridge Motel shelter. The function of that shelter is to, as someone has identified, they have a permanent supportive housing voucher. This is a place they can stay until they get into that housing unit. That's not included here because every single exit is to permanent housing, and it would skew some of those results. We also have a motel shelter that is for medical isolation. That is not included here because that facility is not housing focused. It's really geared more towards helping our whole shelter system stay healthy by providing folks a safe place to isolate if they have a contagious disease. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of front load the discussion and we'll circle back to this at the end. Doc is going to review all the data what we learned about our programs on a really more detailed level by type, but we also came up with some findings in general. One of them is that, as we know, there is a resource shortage across our shelter programs, and specifically, the programs had limited and unequal access to housing resources across the adult shelter program. You'll see this results in varying housing outcomes across the adult shelter system. We're going to talk a lot about differences by type, but sort of one of my takeaways is type and programming are really important, but it's housing resources that lead to housing exit. That is a really important relationship, and we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how we run our system. We will also walk through a theoretical model. I'm going to do a quick overview, and then Doc will go into more detail, that we think we have an opportunity to shelter and house more people with fewer units if we can use housing resources to help folks move through those shelters to housing. Next slide, please. So I'm kind of stealing Doc's headline here, but I'm going to quickly introduce a theoretical model. It will make more sense when we go through it again at the end once you've seen the data, but sort of aligning with, show them what you're going to show them and then show them again. I'm kind of leading with that headline here. Essentially, as of right now, our current average length of stay for folks who are exiting to housing is 160 days. Over half of our shelters are under 180. So we have sort of what is a reasonable length of stay. However, we're not having not enough people are exiting shelter to housing. If we have some shelters that are 50% exit rate. That means 50% of exits from that shelter are going into housing. If we can increase that so that all shelters have at least a 50% exit rate, or they're exiting at least one person per shelter unit per year, if we have fewer shelter units, we can house the same or more number of people. That is contingent upon having more housing placement resources for those fewer number of units. So to get sort of into the numbers, Doc will show that last year 840 people exited shelter for housing. We think we can do that and more with fewer shelter units if we have more housing resources per unit. Next slide. Okay, I'm now going to pass it to Doc to get into the numbers.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Doc Ramblings. I'm a Research Evaluation Analyst Senior for the Homeless Services Department. So I'm going to start with a brief review of some of the main findings about different shelter types. And I want to be clear that these findings are only representative of shelters in Multnomah County in FY 2025. These results aren't intended to be generalizable to shelter in other locations or time periods. So in FY 2025, we found that congregate shelters were the most cost-effective shelter type. They had the lowest cost per bed and nearly as many exits per bed as motel shelters had per unit.
Do we need the next slide?
Oh, sorry, next slide, thank you. There we go. All right, so like I said, congregate shelters were the most cost-effective shelter type. They had the lowest cost per bed and nearly as many exits per bed as motel shelters had per unit in FY 2025. Congregate shelters also exited the largest number of people to permanent housing per individual shelter program on average. Next slide, please. So motel shelters were the most effective overall at exiting people to permanent housing in FY 2025. They had the highest average exits to permanent housing rates, and they had the most exits to permanent housing per unit. Most of these programs were highly resourced. They had additional supplemental funding coming in, which led to better housing outcomes. And motel shelters were also the most expensive shelter type per unit in FY 2025. Next slide, please. Alternative shelters were more expensive than congregate shelters, but slightly less expensive than motel shelters. And they had the fewest exits to permanent housing per bed or unit. But it's also important to note that they had very limited access to additional housing resources, and we're going to discuss that in a later slide. We also know that alternative shelters served higher proportions of people experiencing chronic homelessness in FY 2025, which can also impact their outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to walk through some of the data that's presented in the review. In this slide and several of the following slides, there's charts where the data is disaggregated by shelter type. In the full report, the data for each of these metrics is disaggregated further into the individual program level, but for the sake of time today, we're only going to be reviewing the higher level disaggregation. So in FY 2025, from these 31 programs, we had 6,731 individuals that were served by shelter. About a third of those individuals were experiencing chronic homelessness. And as we just mentioned, alternative shelters served the greatest portion of chronically homeless individuals in FY 2025. Next slide. And now we'll take a look at length of stay, which is the duration people spent in shelter before exiting. The first chart on the left is the average length of stay for all those who exited, which was 73 days. And then if we hone in on folks who exited permanent housing, that number jumps up to 160 days. We think it's really helpful to understand this difference because it highlights that it does take folks a bit longer to exit to permanent housing and gives us a better idea of how long on average it takes folks to leave shelter to go to permanent housing. Here we can see that the stays were shortest at congregate shelters and then longer at alternative and motel shelters, respectively. Next slide, please. So we had 841 individuals who exited to permanent housing from the included shelters in fiscal year 2025. That resulted in an exit to permanent housing rate of 16%. And it's important to note when looking at this pie chart that the number of programs is different for each type of shelter. The 534 people who exited from congregate shelter came from 14 different programs. There are 12 alternative programs in the review and 6 motel programs. So the exit to permanent housing rate was highest for motel shelters and lowest for congregate shelters. Next slide. All right, so over the past year, the HSD evaluation and data teams have identified some important limitations of using exit to permanent housing rates as a measure of shelter housing performance. Exit rates can obscure the actual number of people that are being talked about, and so counts are often represented along with the rates in an attempt to add some clarity here. But in some cases, programs that house more people can actually have lower rates than programs that house comparatively few people. Additionally, the exit to permanent housing rate is not affected by length of stay, which is an additional metric that we use to track shelter performance. So programs with longer lengths of stay, which leads to less throughput or turnover, can actually still have higher exit to permanent housing rates. Next slide. So in light of those limitations, we've worked on some stuff, and we're proposing the addition of a new metric to better help track shelter housing performance. With this metric, we've calculated the number of individuals that exited permanent housing per shelter unit or bed during the fiscal year. You can see that for all the included programs, this number was 0.39 exits to permanent housing per bed or unit. In other words, for every 2.5 shelter beds or units included in the review, a single individual exited permanent housing. We are still considering this an exploratory metric. Our data and evaluation teams are working towards an updated shelter monitoring strategy that may include this metric or something similar. And just want to be clear, this is exploratory. This isn't being used to actually measure shelter performance now. We just used it in this report to add some clarity. Next slide, please. Okay, so the primary benefit of this new metric is that it is directly linked to the actual number of people exiting the permanent housing and the length of stay at shelters. We think this may provide a clear representation of housing performance at shelter programs and also allows us to more easily compare the cost per unit to performance. One limitation of this metric is that it cannot be compared over different lengths of time, the way exit to permanent housing rates can. And so in the next couple of slides, I put together just a couple examples to help illustrate the difference between the stories these two metrics tell. Next slide. So in example scenario 1, 2 shelters both have 10 units for a year. And during that year, 1 person exits from shelter A to permanent housing, 10 people exit from shelter B, and 7 of those go to permanent housing. Using exit rates, shelter A appears to be performing better at housing people, but shelter B actually exited 7 times as many people to permanent housing using the same number of shelter units. The new metric clearly communicates this difference around housing performance. Next slide. And so again, in this example too, we have 2 shelters that have 10 units for 1 year. And during that year, 10 people exit from shelter A to permanent housing, 13 people exit from shelter B to permanent housing, and 13 people exit from shelter B. 10 of those go to permanent housing, 2 go to motel shelters, and 1 person returns to homelessness. Using our current metric, Shelter A appears to be performing better, but both programs actually have the same number of people exit to permanent housing with the same amount of units. Using the new metric, the housing performance of Shelter B does not appear worse based on other exit destination types. We think this is especially important for congregate shelters, which usually have much lower exit to permanent housing rates, partially due to having many more unreported exits. The new metric shows us that congregate shelters actually exited nearly as many people per bed as motel shelters did per unit. It's also important for shelters that exit a noteworthy number of participants to other shelters, like Gresham Women's Shelter or Y East, for example, as part of an indirect pathway to housing. And these and some other exit types that are often considered positive exits by the shelter programs end up counting against their exit to permanent housing rates. So in the next slide, we can see how these two metrics compare side by side and how they paint pretty different pictures. Despite having lowered exit permanent housing rates, congregate shelters were responsible for more than twice as many exits to permanent housing per bed or unit than alternative shelters were in FY 2025. Motel shelters were still performing the best by this new metric, but the difference between motel and congregate shelters is less substantial using this new metric. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on from performance, we're going to talk about total program cost. And as Anna mentioned, for this review, total program cost comes from a data collection effort that we conducted in the fall of last year at the request of Oregon Housing and Community Services. This amount includes the total expense to operate each shelter from all funding sources. And so this approach might differ slightly from some of our previous analyses in which we only included expenses that the county or city could account for. So the total cost for these 31 programs included in the review was $98 million. And as I said before, this was the combined cost of 12 congregate shelters, 11 alternative shelters, 6 motel shelters, and 2 shelters that were actually a combination of different shelter types. Next slide, please. We break the cost per program down to cost per bed or unit, as this allows us to see how those costs compare across shelter types and programs. Cost per bed was calculated for congregate shelters, and cost per unit was calculated for alternative and motel shelters. So the cost per bed or unit might be higher here than we've previously reported because it does include that entire cost for all programs from all funding sources. So breaking the numbers down this way, we found that congregate shelters had the lowest cost per bed in FY 2025, and motel shelters had the highest cost per unit. And it is important to note here that a few alternative and motel shelters do allow a limited amount of double occupancy, which would have resulted in a slightly lower cost per bed than the cost per unit that was calculated. Next slide, please. Okay, so using this new performance metric, we can directly compare the cost per bed or unit with the number of exits per bed or unit. As discussed in earlier slides, motel shelters were the most expensive per unit and also had the most exits to permanent housing per unit. Alternative shelters were more expensive per unit than congregate shelters, but had less exits to permanent housing. And it's important to note here that permanent housing outcomes were affected by additional resources. They're not only impacted by the total program cost, and we're going to discuss that in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. All right, so in FY 2025, we distributed $9.8 million through housing placement out of shelter and in-reach programs. These are programs, the programs we're talking about here only serve adults. Both in-reach and housing placement out of shelter programs are designed to help people move from shelter into housing. The funds for these programs aren't distributed directly to shelter programs, but to providers who can use them across multiple shelter locations. So these programs placed a total of 598 unique people from shelter into housing in FY 2025. We track housing placements for these programs using an HMID, or housing move-in date, and that's entered by the programs providing those housing placement services. Shelter exit destinations are tracked using information provided by participants when they leave a shelter, and so that is where we get the exit destination from. So by cross-referencing those two data points, the housing move-in dates and the exits to permanent housing, we were able to identify about half of the individuals that were placed into housing by these programs in FY 2025 that also exited from one of the shelters included in this review. And so those 278 housing placements with corresponding shelter exits that are included in the review are identified on the next slide. So The bottom bar on this one represents the total 841 people that exited from shelter. The yellow bar represents the 278 people that we know exited because they were enrolled in one of those housing placement out of shelter or in-reach programs. And then we have it also broken down by shelter type. As you can see in the bottom bar, these programs were associated with approximately 1/3 of all of our exits to permanent housing from shelter in FY 2025. The programs had the largest impact on motel shelters. They accounted for more than half of all of their exits to permanent housing, and they had a smaller impact on congregate motel shelters where they only accounted for about 1/4 of their exits to permanent housing. We can also see here that the total number of housing placements from one of these programs was very small for alternative shelters, only totaling 29 individuals in the fiscal year. Okay, next slide. Mhm.
So what constitutes unrelated exits?
Yeah, so the unrelated exits are just the people who reported exiting from a shelter, but were not enrolled in one of these programs.
But you're assuming that they did go to permanent housing?
It's a self-reported metric, so to the best of our knowledge, based on what the person told us when they left a shelter. The housing placement out of shelter and in-reach programs, their exit metrics are based off of an actual signed lease or contract agreement. So those are confirmed that the person has a move-in date at a location that we're aware of. Compared to the other ones, it's based on the person saying, yes, I am going into this situation when I leave here today.
Can I provide one? One example could be, we have other rapid rehousing programs that place people into housing. So there could be someone who was staying in a shelter, but had a relationship with a worker that was not specifically that placement out of shelter funding program. So they could have exited via a different program. It's just not captured in our narrow look at this one type of program.
All right, let's go to the next slide. We're going to change tracks a bit and briefly review the findings of the racial equity analysis we did of the shelter programs in the review. For this part of the analysis, we compared the racial makeup of people served by shelter programs to the racial makeup of everyone experiencing homelessness on our by name list. With only one exception, all racial and ethnic groups except white were underserved by all shelter types included in this review in FY 2025. Some individual shelters were able to appropriately serve or slightly overserve these groups, but on average, they were underserved across the shelter system. The two racial ethnic groups that faced the most noteworthy underrepresentation were the Hispanic, Latina, and Black African American or African populations. Next slide, please. On the other hand, the white population was overrepresented across the shelter system, or at least across the shelters included in this review. White individuals represented 59% of the total population for programs in this review, compared to 49% of people on the all homelessness by name list. This trend held across shelter types with just a bit of variance. And this overrepresentation was especially acute among several alternative shelters, with the primary exceptions being a few of the villages that do prioritize BIPOC participants as part of their programming. Next slide. Okay, moving right along and changing tracks again, we're going to talk about some of the qualitative findings from the review. As Anna mentioned, a survey was completed for all programs that were included in this review, and two of the questions on there were open-ended questions that asked about both the strategies implemented at the shelter program to move people into housing and then barriers that they faced. These common housing strategies and barriers were identified across the responses, and you can read about each of them in more detail. And we've invited some providers here today who may be able to elaborate on some of these strategies and barriers, but I'm just going to review them briefly first. Some of the most prominent ones were case management, housing navigation, and service referrals. This was identified by most shelters. Skill building, employment programs, and focusing on long-term stability were also very common among shelter programs, as well as reducing participant barriers and building plans that centered around participant goals and preferences. Next slide, please. Several of the programs included connecting participants to housing subsidies and other funding resources, as well as partnering with outside organizations like housing placement providers, and even sometimes like individual landlords and apartment communities. Two slightly less common but noteworthy strategies included transferring participants to other shelters or in some cases institutional settings, and then prioritizing participants for housing resources based on a variety of different factors. Next slide, please. Moving on to barriers to housing, folks. A lack of affordable housing, especially deeply affordable housing, and a shortage of housing subsidies were the two most common barriers across all shelter types. Inadequate program funding was also frequently mentioned, both in terms of staffing and also rental and housing assistance. High participant acuity and limited access to appropriate and relevant services was also mentioned by several providers. And a slightly less common, but still noteworthy barrier was participant preferences and participant hesitancy around moving into housing, as well as a lack of engagement in housing-focused services by some participants. Next slide.
Okay, we are lucky enough to have 3 providers here to come provide their own perspective on housing strategies and barriers. So we're going to hop away and we're going to welcome Tony Bernal from Transition Projects, Marcia Castaneda from Our Just Future, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, and Alicia Hovanes from Sunstone.
Welcome, everyone. Please feel free to come down to the dais. And in order for the mics to work, you just have to hit the button so that the green light is showing. Great. And who wants to go first?
Sure, I can.
Okay, great.
Alicia Hovanes.
Oh, it's very sensitive. There you are. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alicia Hovanes, and I'm the COO of Sunstone Way. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. In light of this report, I want to talk about the barriers to housing we face as shelter providers, but not in the way that it's usually framed. The issue we're facing is not a lack of effort, compassion, or skill, but rather a growing mismatch between who shelters were designed for and who we are now serving. Housing is often discussed as the solution, with the assumption that most people can live on their own if they just get a job and pull their life together, and with a little push and maybe paying for some of their rent, the assumption is that that's attainable. 80 to 90% of the people we serve need ongoing support to remain housed, whether that's financial, medical, psychiatric, or behavioral. Many are not reality-based. Many cannot manage their medications. Others cannot perform basic self-care. Many are medically fragile, and some have fixed delusions that make independent living unsafe. These are not people refusing help. These are people whose needs exceed what a shelter or even standard supportive housing is designed to provide. I want to share a few brief examples, not to shock and not to blame, but to illustrate this acuity gap. At our congregate shelter, we had a participant who became suddenly agitated without an obvious trigger. Our program manager, Joelle, who's been doing this work for over a decade, approached the man calmly and then backed away when he escalated verbally, exactly as trained. Despite this, the participant stripped down naked in a crowded shelter in front of 100 people, defecated in his hand, threw feces at staff, and when he missed, he picked up a heavy glass Yankee candle and hurled it at Joelle's head. Joelle dodged the candle and avoided serious injury by a few centimeters. This is not a behavioral health issue resolved by housing navigation or case management. This is an acute psychiatric episode occurring in a non-clinical environment. At one of our villages, a participant, again, defecated in her pod, smeared feces across the walls, her bed, and all over her body. Staff spent hours carefully coaxing her to walk across the village to a shower, relying on every piece of trauma-informed care and de-escalation training they had. This same individual later drank bleach while on site. This is not non-compliance in case management. This is a loss of self-care capacity requiring 24 supportive care. The last story I want to share with you is about a participant who was staying in one of our motel shelters. This participant broke through the bathroom drywall to access and break open plumbing pipes, convinced that the FBI had planted wiretaps inside of them. This belief was fixed. No amount of reassurance or behavioral health engagement, even from a licensed clinical social worker, could fix it. When someone's needs fall far outside what a shelter-based, housing-focused system is designed to address, our ability to help them meaningfully is constrained, no matter how skilled or committed our staff are. I want to be very clear about something. When people are housing ready, our staff are extremely effective. They help participants secure identification, enroll in benefits, complete certifications, stabilize income, teach budgeting, and successfully move into housing. But most of the people we're serving today are not housing ready. There's a fundamental mismatch between supply and demand. For the majority of the individuals we serve, the gap between what they need and what our current homeless services system is designed to provide is simply too wide for housing-focused interventions to bridge. Shelters should not be short-term stabilization for people who are housing ready, not the default placement for people with severe illness. Many people cycle between shelters, ERs, and the streets because they're too sick to live independently, but not sick enough to qualify for inpatient care. The absence of humane, long-term options is pushing people into jails and shelters, systems that were never designed for that role. Until we build better options, shelters will continue to function as under-resourced pseudo-psychiatric and medical facilities, and staff turnover will remain high because what people signed up to do doesn't match the needs of what they're being asked to do. The cycle is costly for the county and devastating for human lives. But the problem is not that people are failing the system. The problem is that the system has failed to build what the people actually need. What we're suggesting is not doing something to the people, but rather building the right places for them. Oregon has a history of leading with innovation and humanity. This is the next step, designing care environments that actually meet the needs of what we're seeing. For some people, that looks like environments that blend housing with clinical care. For others, it means smaller relational settings where daily life is shared and supported. And for others, it means places to recover and stabilize before permanent decisions are made. These aren't radical ideas. They're already working in pockets, here and in other states. What's missing is not evidence, but the will to build them at scale. We don't need to invent something entirely new. We need to connect what we already know works in a coherent continuum and have the courage to name that gap honestly. Thank you.
So much. Morning.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners. Good to see you all. For the record, I am Tony Brunell, Chief Executive Officer of Transition Projects, and I use he, him pronouns. I want to start with one core idea, and that's that we should separate housing assistance from shelter models in our thinking. Transition Projects operates 9 shelters, and across those programs, housing case management and rental assistance are funded very differently. That difference matters far more than whether a shelter is congregate, motel-based, or something else. Ideally, anyone entering a publicly funded shelter should have access to the same housing opportunities, regardless of where they are staying. Related to that, I would caution against spending too much time trying to link specific shelter models to housing outcomes. There's limited evidence that the model itself drives housing placements. What consistently makes a difference is whether housing case management and rental assistance are available. And we see this in our own work. We operate congregate shelters that place significant numbers of people in the housing, and we operate a motel shelter that does the same. Different models offer different benefits. Motel and alternative shelters tend to provide more privacy and autonomy. Congregate shelters are more cost efficient and allow us to serve more people. Some shelters are designed to serve culturally specific populations. Those distinctions matter, but the connection between shelter model and housing placement is often overstated. What does work reliably is targeted housing case management paired with rental assistance. When those resources are embedded in shelter budgets or provided through focused in-reach, we see results across shelter types and across providers. I would also like to encourage us to think about shelter success more broadly than just a percentage of exits to permanent housing. A key question is whether we're matching the right interventions to people's needs as they leave shelter. If someone is chronically homeless, are we connecting them to permanent supportive housing, treatment, and behavioral health care services? If someone exits shelter with rapid rehousing assistance, do they have a realistic path to income stability before that assistance ends? And if someone needs assisted living or memory care, are we as a system helping them access those settings? The needs of people experiencing homelessness have never been more complex. In a one-size-fits-all approach, particularly one that relies too heavily on rapid rehousing as a means to exit shelter, won't meet the full range of the needs we're seeing. While moving people into housing is a top-tier objective for my agency, it's not the only outcome that matters. Shelters provide other public value as well. As you know, there are roughly 12,000 people experiencing homelessness in the metro area and about 10,500 of them in Multnomah County, and roughly half are unsheltered. From a systems perspective, simply getting people indoors itself is a meaningful outcome, and the county has made real progress there. There are other shelter features worth considering too. Some shelters provide deeper supportive services for specific populations, such as people who are medically vulnerable or veterans. Some have on-site clinics or co-located services that directly meet urgent needs. And in some cases, exits to substance abuse treatment, adult foster care, or memory care are appropriate and positive outcomes that we should also be considering. Not everyone is going to thrive in independent living. There we go. Finally, I want to raise the question of cost and trade-offs, which is ultimately a commission-level issue. Both staff and participants generally prefer programs that offer more privacy, particularly motel shelters. At the same time, providing that privacy comes at a significant premium, with some programs costing 3 or 4 times per unit the cost of other shelter programs. That raises a fundamental question: how do we balance privacy and program design preferences with our responsibility to serve as many citizens of Multnomah County as possible with the resources that we have? I appreciate the Commission's engagement on these issues and HSD's leadership as well. As we move towards fiscal year 27, you will be making critical decisions about our public priorities and how we can best serve people at a time when local and state resources are shrinking and federal support is retreating. The work of this commission becomes more important than ever in ensuring that we are prioritizing the right programs going forward. Please let us know how we can help.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning.
Hello, good morning. My name is Marcy Cartagena. I am the Director of Emergency Services at Our Just Future, overseeing our 3 emergency shelters, 2 in the adult system and 1 in the family system. Gresham Women's Shelter opened up as a 24/7 shelter 9 years ago in 2016. As a congregate low-barrier shelter, we see participants from many walks of life struggling through a variety of challenging and acute needs. While GWS is not fully confidential shelter, it does prioritize and open beds to our DV and SA referring partners. Congregate settings do tend to be more cost-effective, but this model is not for everyone, as we see interpersonal issues come up with folks in a tight living space. At its inception, GWS was a pretty bare-bones model with minimal amenities. It started with a single position aimed to support participants navigate a convoluted system of care. We all know how challenging it is for participants to connect to services and help them overcome housing barriers. That one position grew into a whole team of housing advocates, peer support specialists, and retention workers. In fiscal year 25, this team diligently worked to support 37 participants into permanent housing and offer peer support services to address challenges with someone who had navigated through the continuum of care themselves. Beyond that, an assessment was created to identify participants who were ready to focus on pursuing permanent housing. Our other shelter, Chestnut Tree, opened up in 2021 during COVID to prioritize keeping vulnerable people safe. In fiscal year 24, we saw the opportunity to focus our efforts and transition to a new model that was housing focused. Referrals directly from the Gresham Women's Shelter were of participants who expressed wanting to work diligently toward housing goals and be held accountable for engagement. In fiscal year 25, 66 participants exited to permanent housing through our internal rapid rehousing program. That was 47% of the total participants who stayed at Chestnut. That percent was set to increase in fiscal year 26, but due to the fiscal year's funding cuts, Chestnut and Gresham Women's Shelter will no longer have the ability to house any new participants. We will be pivoting back to focusing on medically vulnerable individuals in order to provide safety off the streets as a priority. We are hopeful that external partners will have openings for their programs. Historically, these partnerships have been challenging because of staff turnover that caused participants to fall through the cracks and be forgotten. Our fundraising team is actively pursuing grants for flexible funds that can be used for client and rent assistance. These numbers from fiscal year '25 are important to assess because we are not going to see these numbers again in fiscal year '26. Funding these types of programs, as we've seen through this report, these methods are proven, but without your support and funding, we're not going to get anywhere. So we do look to our community this fiscal year to really help us get a few more numbers on our reports, but they're not going to be the same this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. While we have the providers up here, I want to give the board a chance to ask any questions before we bring Anna and Doc back up. All right, I think we're, thank you so, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I wasn't sure. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
I'll follow. Yeah, I appreciated all your comments. Thank you very much. And I can tell you put a lot of thought into that, and it's appreciated. Something that many of you referenced that resonated with me that is, really hard to capture in something like this is individuals who may not, the best placement long-term may not be independent living. And I was curious from your various perspectives, what resources have you been able to connect people with, and in what circumstances is there just like a total lack of resources? Just to kind of get a sense of like where our system is unable to meet need.
So before we had so many resources at the Gresham Women's Shelter, we would see participants staying with us for years, 1 year, 2 years. They would get exited, they'd come back. And a lot of those participants were ones that needed more supportive services in their day-to-day life, not just, permanent supportive housing that comes with permanent supportive services, but we would be attempting to connect them with aging and disability services, agencies that worked with adults with developmental delays and challenges, and all of those resources are extremely scarce. A lot of the participants, we would try housing then with our rapid rehousing dollars, but they would prefer to be in a congregate communal space because of their own sense of safety, support, stability, and we recognize that need that they were asking of us. So instead of looking at the length of stay, our main priority was to focus on safety off the streets for them. So I think when we get dinged for how long our average length of stay is, I think we're also providing a resource to the community of allowing folks to have a dignified space. That's not the streets, and it's not housing. We're not meant to be permanent housing for folks. We are called emergency shelters, and access into our space should be accessible for a lot of folks. So instead of focusing so much on length of stay that I feel like now has become such a hot topic, we just simply want to keep people safe off the streets. And we do hope that there are more resources in the community to support people's mental health, physical health, everything that our amazing staff try to do day to day. But those services don't exist out there. There isn't as many adult foster homes as we would hope, or congregate communal spaces that are considered housing that aren't shelter. So if we can focus on the types of models that we have of housing, I think we would get a lot further in what our success looks like as a system and continuum of care. Thank you.
I think we have to have a real conversation about the limits of permanent supportive housing and who has needs that are beyond that. I think the gaps are no surprise to anyone. Mental health, treatment, as the population we're serving ages, and that has been a fundamental shift. Assisted living, all of these, I think, become more important, and I think the sort of traditional response from the homeless system has been that we're going to move everybody into independent living, and that is not, I think, what is needed at this moment. And so we really are going to have to design systems that in many cases don't exist currently to fill these gaps.
I just wanted to follow up there on that question with, when I was a practitioner, there was a challenge of people needing certain diagnoses or credentials to be able to refer into certain programs. And it continues to be, I think, from where I sit, it looks like it's still a silo. Is that still a challenge for you all, is actually, not even if the service exists, but your ability as a homeless service provider and not clinicians to actually get people referred into those programs? I see a lot of head nods.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
I would say for us, that's less of an issue. We do have a licensed clinical social worker, but the logjam occurs with aging and disability. There's too few people that work there and not enough resources to get them placement once we access them, and it can take upwards of a year to get someone through the aging and disability system. And if our length of stay is limited and we're trying to not exit them to the street, but what we're being measured on is housing outcomes, that puts us in a precarious place.
And to follow up, I think when this board did our first work session, we looked at positive exits and included a lot of the things that I hear you all talking about. So I would say just to know that part of our conversation is definitely, it's not just permanent housing. There are these other types that we know are a good next step for that person out of shelter.
Thank you. Commissioner Brim Edwards.
Thank you for each of you sharing your experiences and also for the services you provide every day for our community and individuals in need. I appreciate you all have different models and different populations you serve, sort of across your system. I have just a couple questions just in terms of the framing of just how we should think about it. What would you say the one or two most important, so we have some recommendations and it's sort of a potential new model and metric. What are the one or two most important things that the county could provide you to better support improved outcomes for people who are exiting your shelters?
Housing dollars. We don't have housing dollars to use this fiscal year anymore. Our funds were significantly cut because of being state funded in that area. I know that the city has utilized a lot of their funds for a lot of the shelters that they're standing up, but in order for us to continue in this model and doing the work that we were doing, we do need a diversified funding source. So if it's not state, we would love county funds or city funds. Thank you.
I would say clinical resources in shelter increasingly, and I think the county's made some really great progress with the shelter behavioral health team, but I think more of that support to keep people stable and in shelter until we can get them to another intervention, I think is really important. But increasingly, shelters have become this place of crisis.
I would say it's additional residential places that we can send people to, or step-down facilities, somewhere that's not quite inpatient care with the state hospital and not inpatient with local hospitals, but something in between that our shelters, our staff can't provide care for.
Now, y'all only said one, so please do say another if you've got one. She said two.
Yeah. So another just question I would have is, so like if we look at this new metric, and this is going to be a question I have for staff as well about just the whether we're looking, so we looked at cost, the type of shelter, Tony, as you managed, it's less the type, but maybe what sort of case management services and other things are offered. If you were to have add sort of a additional sort of criteria that we should look at in terms of like the types of services that are offered? What, in terms of making an analysis of, it's not necessarily the type, but the type of services, what would that look like of, like, this is the most important thing? And again, it's not necessarily, you may not be the specific type or how much it costs, but like, it's because we have these things that we're getting different outcome. What would that be?
I can go first. And forgive me if I'm not answering your question correctly. I know that we need a lot more substance use disorder treatment options that are not just a short-term detox and then where do you go afterwards? You're going back to the street or back to the shelter. And I don't know necessarily what that looks like for us as shelter providers who are non-clinical, but we do need somewhere to send them that is more an in-between detox and a long-term rehab situation.
Great, thanks.
I'll just second that.
I will third that.
Great, okay.
Yeah, I think that does come with policy change, and I know we've attempted to work closely with Gresham PD and Portland PD. It is hard for us to hold folks accountable for things that are out here in our community, recognizing trauma-informed care, and folks are using the substances that are out here. But it is impacting our shelters when things tend to be very lenient. And we can't call on, we don't want to call on our police departments, but when we have to, a lot of times they don't show up. So safety for our own shelter spaces, but also our community, they often don't show up.
Thank you.
If I could add to that real quick. We're also seeing folks that have become clean over time, and they're having long-term psychosis from the way that drugs have changed and impacted their brains. So they don't necessarily need rehab, but they can't sustain living on their own, and we're not really, this is a population where this is too new that we're not really sure what to do to serve them best.
So that's people who are in recovery, but because of long-term substance use, needs just an elevated level of support, not
Exactly.
necessarily, I mean, they're in recovery, but they need additional resources because
Right.
of the impact of use.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? What happens when you do reach out to aging disability services, DD services, or behavioral health? What is your experience?
For us, with aging and disability, it just takes a very long time in order to get somebody to come on site to evaluate them. And then there's also the high probability that someone is they're too acute to stay in the shelter. There's too many triggers where it's going to lead to them being exited before the months go by where aging and disability can finally get on site to evaluate the person.
It's taking months?
Okay.
That's been our experience as well. We had somebody who was struggling with what we believed to be dementia, and we were consistently calling them to come and do an evaluation. When they did come on site, I think partly because our staff are so supportive, they saw the participants' living area and they're like, oh, it's organized, it's clean. There's no way this person has dementia. And we shared our experience of them living day to day and how staff had to help them every day, multiple times throughout the day, to just remember to go to the bathroom, to take their meds, things that they're not equipped to or trained to do necessarily, but they care a lot about these participants. And we had to go to the extent of saying, we will have to exclude this participant because of their behaviors of, forgetting to not eat in the common area and just really basic things for them to take us more seriously. They also do share with us that they're not housing providers. So one, they can do the assessment, but finding appropriate housing for these individuals will be a whole other process. So while they can maybe allow for them to have a set amount of hours of a paid caregiver, their job isn't necessarily housing this individual outside of shelter. So it's a difficult and challenging system that we're working with, and we do see a lot of aging population come into our shelters, and our hearts break for them because the alternative shouldn't be the streets. Like, these are folks that are past the age of retirement and deserve better.
I want to just add, I so appreciate this perspective that you all are bringing, and these are not new problems for this system, and it just feels like at some point, we have got to figure out how to de-silo ourselves as opposed to asking these providers to try and figure it out. So I'm really hopeful that as a board, we can commit to that next step as we move into budgeting, because I think that's where we have the opportunity to actually stop asking homeless services to do all the services that the county provides, because that's not actually their job, nor do they have the resource to do it.
Yeah, I want to thank you all so much for sharing the experiences here, and these are things, things that we have heard about and are working on, but we need more. And I appreciate you raising the impact of some of the state funding cuts on our ability to actually house people within our community. That's something, that was really a difficult work that we had to do earlier when we were doing the state rebalance. And so as we're looking ahead to the next year's budget and the work that's in front of us, this is incredibly helpful. So thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you do every day. We just really appreciate this. And in terms of this, and so I'm going to invite Anna and Doc back up, because I know they're going to have some kind of wrap-up words, but I just do want to acknowledge, part of the work of breaking down the silos. I mean, that is one of the reasons why we have Sarah Morrissey being the COO of both Human Services, DCHS and HSD, because the connections between our departments have to be really strong, because the nexus of the work is so often straddles so many different areas. So, all right, well, welcome back. Thank you so much.
We have a few more slides.
All right, once again, for the record, my name's Doc Ramblings, Research Evaluation Analyst Senior for the Homeless Services Department. Before we move on to our last few slides, I just want to echo something Tony mentioned. We know that the shelter model is not the primary predictor of housing performance or other types of success. In the report, I think that's made clear when we break down all the programs individually. Like I said, for this presentation, we are just breaking it down by shelter type, but we don't believe that is the best way to predict shelter success. All right, next slide, please. So this is revisiting a slide Anna had covered recently, but just to recap, this review has made it clear to us that there was a resource shortage across our adult shelter programs in FY 2025. Limited resources led to shelters included in this review exiting less people to permanent housing, and we know that the distribution of additional resources unequally benefited certain programs' housing performance more than others. We also know that our shelter system will be facing additional funding constraints, both now and in the coming fiscal year, which create additional challenges. This review has highlighted an opportunity to mitigate the impacts of any funding reductions through a realignment of resources. Specifically, we believe we may be able to house and even shelter the same number of people with fewer shelter units across the adult shelter system. And in the next slide, we've laid out a very basic theoretical model of how this might be achieved. So as we talk through this, I'm going to go kind of slow, but just to be clear, this is just a theoretical model. This isn't a solid game plan. So if all housing-focused shelters in our adult system were able to decrease their average length of stay for all exit types to about 180 days or less, this would allow for roughly 2 exits per better unit on average across our shelter system. The average length of stay for exits to permanent housing among the shelters included in this review was an average of 160 days and was under 180 days for more than half of the included programs. In other words, we think this means that in many cases, 180 days can be enough time for people to exit from permanent housing to a shelter, though we know this won't always be the case. If at least half of the individuals that were exiting from shelter were going to permanent housing, that would roughly equate to 1 exit to permanent housing per better unit per year, and that would be 50% exit rate to permanent housing. We know that several of our shelters were already near or above this performance metric in FY 2025, though we also know this may be a heavier lift for some programs. If we were able to achieve that, that would roughly equate to 1 exit to permanent housing per bed or unit across our adult shelter system, which is more than double the 0.39 exits to permanent housing per bed or unit that occurred in FY 2025. At that performance metric, the same number of exits to permanent housing that occurred in FY 2025 with approximately 2,300 shelter beds and units could theoretically be achieved with as few as 841 beds or units with the appropriate amount of resources for each program. At that same metric of 1 exit per bed or unit, there's also a potential to increase the total number of exits to permanent housing annually. The last line on here is an example where if we only had 1,700 shelter beds or units, which is about 700 less than we had in fiscal year 2025, the number of permanent housing exits could theoretically be double what it was in fiscal year 2025. And just as that little circle on the right tries to point out, this definitely all is dependent on increased housing placement resources going to the remaining shelter programs. Next slide.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you to the providers for your testimony. It's so valuable to have you here. I just wanted to talk briefly about next steps. We are already using the information in this report to review our shelter data and other program information. The report focused on some very major aspects of shelter. It does not include some things like, and we'll talk about this, I think, in the work session, like how well a facility is doing. Is that facility still going to be a viable shelter program in the future? So we're reviewing the data from the report alongside all of our other data about programs. We're working with the city staff to really be transparent about how we're thinking about shelter and its role in the community, and using our data with them to kind of think about what we do as a community around shelter. We're really thinking about how we can create that shelter system that effectively, efficiently, and equitably leads to housing, while also providing folks a safe place to be off the street. And we are also using this report as a way to develop a robust shelter monitoring strategy moving forward. We've always done some outcome monitoring, but we're working towards a much more robust model that allows us to do this kind of review more frequently and have this information at our fingertips more regularly. I do want to note we do have another report called the Pathways Report, which is coming out in February. We are doing that in partnership with the Homelessness Resource Action Collaborative at PSU. It's too close to HRAP, sorry. This is built more around the lived experience of folks who are going through shelter, and we will be really excited to add that information to this information to get a more robust perspective of our sheltering system. This report is limited by not having that perspective of folks with lived experience, and so we're excited to be able to partner that with the Pathways Report next month. We are now done with our presentation and ready for the work session and discussion.
Thank you so much for all the work on this, especially Doc, the work that you have done, and I know others who have been working on the data pieces of this. This has been a long time in coming, as something that I think we have needed to see and have this look at our shelter system, and really dig into what's happening and how we can align our resources with across the board, from shelter to housing placement, to all of the behavioral health supports that folks need to really be more successful in moving people to permanent supportive housing and having them stay there. Are there questions for Anna and Doug?
I wanted to help frame the work session, since it was, so if I could jump in before we start with questions.
Sure. Were there any questions about the presentation, like anything that didn't get asked during the slides?
Yes.
I'd like to just frame the work session, and then we can just have the whole conversation together.
Okay.
Because I think that it feels
Are they
arbitrary.
connected? I mean, you want to connect the work session to the presentation? Yep. Okay, then go for it.
Thank you. And I just want to appreciate the work that you all did, not just with this report, but in the conversations that we've had since, and kind of how we're going to get to some next steps. I just also want to thank Commissioner Moyer for co-sponsoring the work session portion of our morning. I think I shared with you all a memo last night that I wanted to just share to help frame a little bit. This is the second time that we've looked at data about shelter models, cost, and some of the outcomes. Again, I think there's some more next steps to do with this, but this is something that we started talking about when I got here. Not that you all didn't before, but when I got here in December of '24. And I think it's really critical to remind us that folks often say we can't build our way out of this crisis, and we can also not shelter our way out of this crisis. I really appreciated that we heard from providers that the housing placement resource is such a critical component to what we're doing. And again, I know that the report or the review really focuses on permanent housing placements. So some of what I think I do want to talk with you all about is how we bring back in some of the data around other positive exits. And that leads into what some of the questions are about your slides that I want to make sure we bring up. I think really the key for me is I'm hoping that we don't get stuck in asking for more and more data. We have to get some to some decision points and recommendations and policy direction. So we didn't specifically plan a second kind of work session, but I would say if there may be things that come up that you all want to do as follow-up. And I think at some point it probably makes sense for us to have then another conversation specifically about shelter during when we get into the budget, so we understand what some of those components are and how we're thinking about this system as a whole. So before we jump into questions and conversation, I just wanted to give Commissioner Moyer an opportunity to share as well.
Yeah, I echo very much what Commissioner Singleton has said. I'm very interested in taking this work, but trying to, and I understand there's data behind this data, and this is a very generalized presentation, but I think that there's a level deeper I'm very interested in going, and that's looking at what models and pathways to permanency, either independent living or the right level of support for somebody by subgroup, because I think there are some things that get a little lost when we generalize data, like who is not appropriate for a larger congregate setting, that if a provider is kind of specializing in a community that has some additional needs, their length of stay or their transition to permanent might not measure up in a generalized way, but because of the population that they're working with, it may in fact be the most successful setting for that subgroup. So I preview that as like continued conversation, but what I think is important from our perspective is being able to look at the system as a whole and begin to have some conversations about lessons learned, data, strategies in what I think we all acknowledge is going to be a very difficult road forward. And, there will be no easy choices, but the more these kind of conversations and this kind of data, I think allows us to at least proceed with as much intentionality and thoughtfulness as possible. So I thank everybody. I thank you, Doc, for your work on this. I thank every provider. I don't look at this, at the report with judgment at all, because I know the incredible work that's being done every day. And I do particularly appreciate bringing up structural issues that potentially the county can address that could lead to more positive outcomes. And I share Commissioner Singleton's desire for us to expand our definition of a successful transition, because I personally view exiting to long-term care a huge success for someone. If you can get somebody a permanent placement in a long-term care setting that is right for them, that is, woo, that makes me thrilled. So more conversations to come about how we define success, but also how we interact with you on the data that we're looking for in order to make hard choices. But thank you, because this was a lot of work, and I appreciate that.
right, thank you. So now we can open up for questions about material to Anna and Doc.
Great. First of all, thank you so much for the report. It gives us a lot of data, kind of gives us the inventory and in the universe, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to go back a little bit to what Tony and the other providers mentioned about case management and sort of supportive services. And when I look through here, we have lots of ways we sliced it based on shelter type, the participants, the cost. And on these charts, it provides data about what other services are provided, but it's not clear, like, just, you know, how intense or how effective they are. And if that's a critical factor of, and like say, you know, should we be willing to pay more when we have like these services and get better outcomes? It seems like we need to know like really what role those services are playing, because what we have is like a checkbox, and that may mean, say, there's medical care that comes once a month, or it could be 3 times a week. I mean, it's hard to say. So to me, that's sort of a missing piece in making the analysis, because it may not be the type of shelter at all, but maybe the types of services that are offered or not. So that just a sort of question I have in terms of like the analysis. So if the providers say that's a really important things, that you know, the additional dollars for housing placement, or rent assistance, or case management, like what does that actually look like? And is that the actual factor about whether they're successful or not the form or the amount of money that's been spent on that? So that's one just thought I have as we move ahead. The other question I have, and this is more just a historical question, but also wanting to think about how it informs our path ahead. There was work between the county and the city on the community sheltering strategy, and it was, we are going to create X number of units, whether they're family units, you know, DV, adult shelter, and then based on that, we had a flow through, like predicted flow through, and that was supposed to result in a reduction in both unsheltered homelessness and ultimately homelessness placements to housing. And we didn't hit those rates, so we didn't get the predicted decline. And I see, I feel like now we have, this is like a different model to like increase flow through. If I were gonna, we don't use that term, but that's, I think, what it is. We're gonna do this different thing, use a different model and increase the flow through so we get the predicted decrease in unsheltered homelessness, and also, you know, placements into housing. The question I was having, what is different about what we predicted before and the outflow rates to now, and can we count on that? Because it seems like we need to have some better certainty, because last time we did a lot of things right and we did increase the amount of shelter, but the flow through rates didn't increase, so we didn't get the decline.
No, excellent question. And I actually don't think there is much difference in the model. The difference is looking at it by exits per unit versus like exit rate. And we're still looking at exit rate as in our contracts, but I like exit per unit. We're going to figure out whether or not we put that into our modeling. I think the major difference is that we had a goal in the community sheltering strategy to increase exits from shelter, and we were never able to fund it to the amount that would have actually resulted in that flow through. And one of the things we're trying to talk about now is making sure that we are setting a goal that we can fund and being as ambitious as we can within the resources that we have. And that's why we're putting sort of a reduction of shelter units on the table, because given the size of the constraint that we have, we've got to figure out a way to increase that housing placement resource to get to that housing. So the models actually aren't different. It's the fact that we need to be more serious about actually funding to the goal. And then I did, on your first, the first sort of comment, I wanted to tie it also back to the community sheltering strategy. The community sheltering strategy also talked about having better staffing ratios so that folks could have that case management that does lead to housing. I do want to elevate that we did some rebasing to improve staffing ratios in shelters, and as we look at reduced constraints, it might be very difficult for programs to keep those ratios. So we are going to have to figure out where we make reductions and what makes sense. And if we're adamant that case management is a thing, maybe that's not something we're able to do. So those are the kind of the conversations we're going to have with our providers. What does it look like to run shelter under reduced constraint? Where are we making too deep of a cut that would, even if there's housing placement resources, make it difficult for folks to exit to housing? So all of those things are intermingled, which makes it really tough to move forward. But I do want to elevate the strategy. Also talked about those kinds of services. The commissioner was referencing at the end of the report, there's some data per shelter, and the services available, that's from the survey. And you're totally right. We weren't able to do any kind of correlative analysis with the level.
It wasn't a
or anything
criticism,
like
I
that.
just.
Yeah, would have been great.
Thinking about like how, like, being able to really think about what the provider said was necessary and like how much they actually had. So, in fairness, to be able to go through the analysis of effectiveness and performance, that would be a key thing to know, like how much support they had.
I think I just, Commissioner, want to piggyback on that conversation. Part of, and I just shared the memo because I know I shared it with y'all late, so I brought some copies. My apologies. But the memo that is about the review in particular includes a recommendation for us to look at how we shift from this site-based model of case management and housing placement to a larger in-reach model. And why I'm proposing that is because it's a program I created 6+ years ago at this point. It is multidisciplinary, it includes culturally specific providers, and it allows them to serve across a number of different types of shelters. The first team served Dignity Village and Right to Dream 2, where we saw a decrease of over 10 years in length of stay by bringing housing placement resources out there. So there's things that we know that works really well that I think we should be looking at opportunities to increase and bring more equity to that. To your point about rebasing and trying to have case management and the right levels at each shelter may not be the most financially feasible option, and we have a model that we know works that might be a little bit cheaper.
To piggyback on a piggyback, this is the point we're going to topple.
It's getting heavy.
It is getting heavy, but
Anna will agree.
I echo what Commissioner Singleton is saying, and I do think your ability to get a housing placement should not be determined by the shelter that you walk through, and I know that's not the model we intend to have, but there's still an element of that. And I also feel like we've created a system, and I think we might need to think outside the box how to level the playing field, where providers know what they know. They know their world. They usually know other shelter providers or DV shelters. You kind of know that ecosystem, but when you start entering services that aren't the people you interact with, you don't know them as well. And so, again, your access to some of these are going to be dependent on, what does the staff of that organization know when navigating some of these things are incredibly complicated. I have thought a lot about, if you could reverse time and do it over again, because I don't think necessarily it makes sense to do this now, but I probably would have thought about a hub and spoke model where case management is, centralized and connected to all county and state services, and there may be some, you're working Southwest and you've got the shelters and blah, 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 but the idea being there's no wrong front door, you can still do a system. And I do think that even though we have chosen not to have that internal in the county, I think we still need to functionally find a way for that to be internal. I've had some conversations, this may freak people out, about AI and how actually you can do mobile intake and set up back ends where the information and the conversation pulls up the services they may be eligible for, because I think we need to think about the equity of understanding and navigating systems. And, I think we've been lucky with some of our specific providers who know specific systems. Some of our senior shelter providers or senior housing providers have more relationships and they can navigate that more successfully. But I think, when I think about what we can do that is not a huge cost driver, but could open up some doors. Because, I think anytime we can take somebody who really belongs in a different system and can get more robust services out of the homeless system, that is a win. Especially if we can figure out the housing component with it. I mean, obviously it remains a homeless problem if we can't. But, getting very creative, I think Multnomah County has been advocating and continues to advocate how desperately we need to have access to Medicaid long-term care for our behavioral health. That is like my soapbox that I'm going to die on. But we also need to figure out how we're making sure that, we're navigating somebody who experienced a developmental disability. Or, I think, strangely enough, if you have long-term disability due to substance use disorder and you're not actively in substance use disorder, that's actually aging and physical disability. Like, you wouldn't know that, but, a system would tell you. So you wouldn't even know I've got a 25-year-old who's experiencing potentially long-term psychosis. Well, weirdly, because they were over the age of a certain, you may have, these things are complicated. I don't expect people to know how to navigate it, but I do think we have to figure out if we are going to outsource, and we have outsourced case management, we have to resource that. And that's not really on you, except like you'd have to implement it. But we have to figure out how to even the playing field, because we can't expect people to have that background.
No, and I was going to say, we are thinking very much along the same lines around how do we, if we want to resource things equitably, a more mobile program potentially being the way to go, particularly with reduced resources. So we're thinking along those same lines.
It's called out more in the report, and it might not have been that clear in the presentation due to time limitations, but one of the possible reasons that the extra resources provided by InReach and Housing Placement Out of Shelter programs were inequitably distributed might be related to the way we measure shelter performance. So the providers that also operated shelter, who operated those programs, funneled the resources to the shelters they operate. That's probably in their self-interest and preservation. Like, if you have resources, you want to benefit your programs. And so the report calls out a need for either ensuring there is InReach and housing placement programs that are paired with each shelter location, or ensuring that every provider that operates a shelter also operates those programs, so that there is that level of equitable access for all people at every shelter location.
And I would just, to put a last point on that, that's another piece that I'm recommending, is that right now the behavioral health shelters are a closed loop system from the behavioral health department or division. And so the idea that our shelter providers today can't refer people, the acuity that we heard today, they can't refer into behavioral health shelters, is something to me that's low hanging fruit that we can fix really quickly. And then sorry, Commissioner, we piggybacked off of you and then took a long time.
That's okay. It's been a good discussion and added to it. So an additional question, and this is more like a long-term question about the larger system. I mean, clearly the Metro Supportive Housing Services dollars and funds are absolutely critical to this whole system. And, I think about, losing state funds hurt, or losing, city funds, or the decline in the county. But if we don't have the SHS dollars, I mean, the whole system will fall apart, because We have very much we're building a system where permanent supportive housing implies a long-term commitment. It's not permanent supportive housing until the Metro measure ends. So I am really interested in, as we look at the, and this is less about like next year's budget, but just the longer term, as we look at the excess as we go into permanent supportive housing and what that looks like and the type of services, like what does our financial modeling say that's going to cost? Because what I'm concerned about is, we had a like hurry up offense of like, stand up these shelters, we need our partners to, provide more shelter beds. And then now it's like, oh, actually we want less and we're gonna do this other thing. And so, I think about the system's responsiveness and, filling the long-term needs of the need to have this longer-term strategy. I also think it is very important in order to actually renew the SHS measure, that we have a strategy and that we're not like shifting all the time, that is not thoughtful and focused on the long term, because I think actually that creates a lot of cost inefficiencies. So for example, I think about before I got on the commission, the commission had purchased those 2 lots on 82nd, and one has been opened, and 4 years later, the other one is not yet open. But if all of a sudden it's like, we want less shelter, and that's not the type we want, the county has spent 4 years and not an insignificant amount of money to stand it up. So as part of this longer look on what we decide to do in the shorter term, like how does it fit into a very strategic long-term plan that contemplates how we can successfully support the renewal of the SHS dollars?
And I just want to respond to that, just because before you get a chance to, and because I think you've brought up a lot of really important things, and it's, to me, this is also why it's so important that we have an aligned and agreed to strategy with the city of Portland and our other partners.
In terms, my next thing.
Yeah, in terms of like, yes, I mean, and beyond what our investments are going to look like, because I think when you were talking about like, yes, there was a need, there was a real demand and interest in opening a lot of shelters because we knew that we had so many people living unsheltered, and we still do, living on the streets, and wanted to have places for those to go. As the city has ramped up, overnight only shelters and that kind of capacity that's really on the public space management and getting people a place so that they don't have to be outside, that has changed what our work looks like. And again, always, and I always touch on this in every conversation I have with the mayor and the city folks, is like all of those other parts of the system that are really critical in order to be moving people into the permanent housing, and there has to be connection points between overnight only shelters or more of the emergency shelter and that, but really, okay, so how are we now going to be right-sizing the other parts of the system that have not been, I would say, like getting the resource they needed to be effective and do that long-term? And so that's why the work that we've done in updating the HRAP 2.0 and passing that here and passing that at the city was important. The conversations that are happening right now around our agreements going forward with the city are really important. So I just wanted to talk about that, because I think that has also been a big factor in what investments look like and what they should look like going forward.
I absolutely agree with you, because I also agree with Tony's comment that getting someone off the street and into sort of a safe, secure place where they can get stabilized is a meaningful outcome. And also recognizing that the term permanent supportive housing implies a long-term commitment, and just that has to be just built into the financial modeling that we're thinking about. So I don't know. Now, do you want to?
Well, I just want one on PSH. I think it's important to note, and I've said this before, but we do not have many fidelity models of PSH in this community. I want us to be careful in saying PSH doesn't work, because I don't think we've actually resourced it to do what it needs to do and how it was designed. And almost every successful PSH model leverages Medicaid, and we have done none of that in our community. So just to think about the funding component of it, I think we need to do a bit of a revamp of PSH. It's something that I really want us to be able to spend some time on as well as a board, because we have to provide the providers with enough staffing. It depends. Some places you might just get housing case management. My PSH at Join was you're going to get a housing retention worker. My PSH at Cascadia came with a clinician, a doctor, a prescriber, all the things. And that inequity is also a huge problem on the PSH side of the system.
Yeah, I don't think I said that, so hopefully that wasn't a response. I don't think I said that
No.
PHS doesn't work. I'm looking at the model because when we commit to someone that we're going to, and we know that some people need this long-term support, is how are we actually going to do that? And being thoughtful about, because right now that's based on frankly, a temporary funding measure. 10 years seemed like a long time, but it actually,
Yeah.
it's not permanent.
Yeah, no, that's why I
Okay,
commented.
I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't at all
Is the
saying it didn't work.
Medicaid component of the funding is we haven't actually funded it appropriately to do PSH here.
Well, and I think, to piggyback on that, yet
You're going to get
again,
an answer at some
and
point.
to beat it like a dead horse.
Well, it's a work session.
It's a work session, so we're going to do that. I feel very protective of SHS dollars actually preserving that for that housing piece. And it's not that I don't value flexibility. It is a flexible dollar, and that is great. But the one thing Medicaid won't pay for is the actual bed, which I have feelings about, but that is what it is currently. So for me, I think this is one of those conversations that is very complicated for people who don't love to nerd out on government systems and rules, but this is that point of partnership with the state. Like, to me, this is the place the state has to be a partner with us so that we are able to do the right levels of support in supported housing. There are people who, even at a pretty high degree of support, which I think is a limited number of permanent supported housing, there are people whose need is above that, who really need to be in a different setting, and they are legally entitled to it. I mean, that to me is where my frustration with the state has, well, frankly, boiled over in this room several times. But when I keep talking about, we have to enroll in Medicaid, it's this exact issue. It's exactly what our providers are saying, that the need of their participant is not able to be served in really any housing-focused environment. It has to be a wraparound approach that's individualized, which is exactly what Medicaid long-term care is. And, so for anybody in the media who might be watching this, it is vitally important to Multnomah County, and I would argue every county in Oregon, that the state step up as a partner and open the door to Medicaid long-term care for people whose diagnosis is severe persistent mental illness and qualify. There are lots of people who have severe persistent mental illness who don't qualify, and that's not who we're talking about. We are talking about people who have a permanent level of disability and cannot safely take care of themselves and are legally entitled to Medicaid. And the state has to partner with us and open up the door. I mean, there is no clearer way to say that. We have talked so much about this and what a difference it will make for people. And it is not right that the state of Oregon discriminates against people by the type of disability that they have. If you are a person who is physically disabled and needs that same level of care, we have a system for you. Is it perfect? No. We heard that we have to work on timelines and a sense of urgency and maybe have some resource or model questions, but at least it's there. On the behavioral health side, it is a door slammed in the face of people who are living with disability, and it is unconscionable. And I really appreciate that our providers who are the ones who really are pointing out this gap, because, I think we can say this and it sounds like we're pointing the finger at a different government, and I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying that we don't still have a very important role, because we absolutely have to find the right setting for somebody. There may be housing dollars that need to go with it, but we have to have the state here. And I think this was incredibly helpful in kind of framing that in a broader way.
Don't have a ton to add. I think you all stated all of that very well. I think the only thing I would add is one of the innovations that we've been able to get to this year is combining our HMIS data with health share data to get a more detailed understanding of the actual needs of the folks who are experiencing homelessness and also have a mental illness or a substance abuse disorder, which allows us, we know our providers know on an individual basis, we think this person needs these suite of services, but on a community basis, to do the kind of modeling you're talking about, can we get a better sense of like what it might look like and what interventions groups of folks might need, and then who is the appropriate system to provide that resource so that permanent supportive housing can succeed, and then really nail down with what is becoming a more constrained resources, what's the housing portion of that, and where do we need other systems to lean in and support us with those supportive services.
So I'm just going to, because it's been a long time since I asked the first question. So is that long-term modeling happening about like, here's the dollars we'll need to support permanent supportive housing and sort of how that plays out? I'm
not yet begun that. Yeah, we're right now, like, we have the data, what does it look like? We're sort of at the, we have it, what does it look like? And then we need to build those next steps in partnership with HealthShare and other partners.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have about 20 minutes left. I want to ask that we just take a round to get any questions out so that if there is follow-up, then we can do that, and then we can come back to some conversation.
Yeah, I had a question, and again, thank you so much for all the work that went into this. So the new metric that we're looking at tracking, and I really appreciated the examples to show like how it's going to give us a different look and kind of a different measurement than what we have before. But it also occurred to me that it also doesn't necessarily show some of the things, like, for instance, that even though that there are, for instance, like maybe a comparable or even more number of people that are moving into permanent housing from congregate shelter, because there are so many more people in congregate shelter, it's not showing the number of people who are not exiting into permanent housing because there are so many people. So I want to just make sure that we are continuing to tracking that, because we are going to be best served if we increase those numbers overall, including the percentage of people who are actually exiting into a positive environment, whether it's permanent housing or another long-term permanent situation. So that was just not a question, more of a comment, and something that I want to make sure we continue to track. And then you talked about the cost per bed is actually all-inclusive. And I was just curious, like, what is included in there and what isn't included? So when you talk about the cost per bed being all-inclusive, does that include all of the kind of wraparound housing placement support that we mean, or no, it just is talking about the services and programs all-inclusive for a certain site?
Yeah, so that would be just the money that was funded to that shelter program for its operation. In some cases, there are actually client assistance and rent assistance funds built into shelter budgets, but not for every shelter. Yeah. In the cases where that was part of the shelter's budget, it was included. Yeah. But any external services provided by the same provider beyond what's like part of the shelter's budget and spending is not included.
Okay, and I thank you for clarifying that. And I know, Anna, you and I have had these conversations many, many times. The thing that I am really looking at is what is that number that is including the actual housing placement and support dollars that are necessary for successful exits to permanent housing and doing that. So we'll continue to have those conversations even this afternoon. So thank you.
I'm going to put even a finer point on it. I actually want the disaggregated cost of these shelters by taking out operations and separating those. What is operational cost? What is the housing placement resource cost? Because part of what I'm unclear on how much resource we have to repurpose to an in-reach model, and if we don't disaggregate that, we don't have the funds to just keep adding more. So it would be really helpful to be able to look at those differences. I have a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to say them all, and they can all come and follow up. I'll be interested to know the cost of when we kind of get to which sites will stay open. I would love to know the cost of those for 27 so that we're working with real numbers. Wanting to see kind of leverage, so like saying which types of funding sources are in there. If shelters are leveraging other dollars, that's just helpful, I think, for us to know. There's a comment in the report that some shelters have quote unquote indirect pathways to housing. I would love that to be defined. I'm not really clear on what that means. I'm unclear if there's culturally specific shelters that are included in the assessment. I know that we've had, and I will just say, looking at the data and some of the conversations that I know you all have been having, we know shelters are not serving necessarily BIPOC folks at the rate that we need to. So I hope it's also that when we're thinking about sheltering, that we're looking at ensuring that culturally specific providers have the access to rent assistance out of their day centers or in-reach models or whatever that looks like, but we're talking about it as part of this kind of overall strategy. I'm interested to know in placements the disaggregation between chronically homeless so that I understand how many of those folks are being served and actually exiting to permanent housing. In addition, I'd be interested to know how many are exiting to PSH versus rapid rehousing. And I can send these all too. Please don't feel like you have to. Yeah. I'll definitely send email follow-up because I know it's a lot. And I think I will say in the memo I put together, I was agnostic towards the city components because it's a bit of a, what does the city want to do with their money? But I think that piece will also be helpful to understand because they have so many more alternative shelters. There's a flow-through piece that I think we're also missing, right? Not just the behavioral health, I need to refer higher acuity folks here, but also I have a job and being in a congregate shelter is actually really hard for me because I work a swing shift or whatever that might look like. And so people may need different types of, I think getting to some of what you were talking about, Commissioner, different types of settings are more conducive to supporting them. And so I think as you have those conversations with the city, we'll all be interested in how those come, but also how they're not city shelters and county shelters, but they're actually one system. Because I would argue right now that's not the case, and there's not a lot of referrals happening back and forth. So that's something that I would love for us to, not you, us, to figure out.
I'm interested, I'm sorry. No. Okay. I'm interested in, again, maybe diving deeper into acuity, because I think it's really hard to compare to different populations. And both have value, but I want to be able to look at which populations are, if there are outliers, are successful in which models. I think the other thing that I'm interested in, and I don't know to what degree, I know some of our shelter providers kind of specifically create space for people who are beginning their recovery journey, mid-recovery journey, and need a sober place to, and I don't know how, I mean, I find that incredibly valuable, but I don't want, or they encourage someone to exit shelter to a treatment. I don't want to lose that because I think that's a good outcome, but I'm also very curious, and I don't know if this is data we have or this is just conversations, but you know, when somebody comes to shelter and they've engaged, do we have the resources available if somebody at some point wants to address something like a substance use disorder or an untreated mental illness, how are we working with our shelter providers to make that transition smooth, that they continue to have a place to sleep, that they've got recovery housing, so that that option is appealing? You know, I think for a lot of people, that is very difficult to do. It is very difficult to go to treatment if you don't qualify for inpatient or cannot get into inpatient, and you would experience homelessness. That's a difficult journey. So I also am just really curious about to what degree are we helping people who are in shelter who may reach a place where they're ready to address an unmet need. How are we making that a seamless and supported transition?
I think that's a larger conversation. I would say overall, what I think I heard from our providers, and my understanding is there is a lot of work done there, and often the resource isn't there to help them move into it, right? And so it is an ongoing need, but looking at how we can support the shelters to be a place that does support that is the right question for this department, right? And then how do we partner with our other providers? Yeah.
We actually do have several shelters that are substance use disorder focused, where they require abstinence from drugs and alcohol as part of their programmatic, and those programs actually do quite well in terms of housing outcomes and flow through. Some of those, the providers of those programs operate multiple shelters, and so they have a better ability to like move people along the spectrum if they're a good fit for that program. As far as like entry points, like you know, low barrier congregate shelters where that's a positive environment for substance use disorder treatment, I think that is probably rarer.
Do you want me to share my questions, or?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. And again, I don't need to know answers now, but just like other questions I would have is, so like in this contemplation, potentially of reducing the number of shelters, so just, you know, obvious question is like, what about the people who are in those shelters? And I'm also very interested in what the geographic distribution of our, I'll continue to be interested in the geographic distribution of the shelters and the types. We know that, no, I'm not going to make an assumption. It's like, what I've heard from individuals who are in different types of shelters is different things work for different people. And so having this, like, we're going to have one type which we think is the most cost effective, or, you know, gets this particular outcome, I think is not a wise path. So I'm interested in sort of like how, what that looks like in terms of different things for different people and what they need. So that would be what I'd be interested in, because I still believe it's having a shelter option is way better than somebody being on the street with no services, no safety, and, you know, that creates further instability. Then we heard from all three of the providers that substance use services and supports are critical, and this is less for the Homeless Services Department and more for the Health Department. And also our other partners is how do we meet that need? Then, let's see. Oh, I'm going to go back to this is a little bit of a riff off of Commissioner Singleton's question on the city. So having been through sort of the IGA approval and the work that, I think some very intentional work we did together. And then there was a lot of work that would happen just like completely separately. So the city of Portland had some very distinct focus and actions they wanted to take. We also had with the city of Gresham, them having like, this is what works for our community. So I believe that even when we disagree on approaches, that it's better when we're talking about the impacts. So you've decided you're going to do X. How is that impacting, you know, what we're doing? And so will be interested in hearing more about, as we're moving ahead with our modeling and recommendations are coming to the commission, that we have a perspective of how sort of approach and how we're going to interact and work with the city of Portland. And importantly, I think we learned something with Cook Plaza, that the city of Gresham has also a distinct approach that they want to pursue, and that, again, how do we best serve our joint constituents in a way when sometimes we have different approaches, different funding streams, different priorities. But I think people will be best served if there's a high level of communication. And so we understand the impacts even when we're maybe not completely aligned on approach.
Just to that last one, and we can, all of those things are things we're really thinking about in terms of like, if we do have to reduce, geography is really important. I do think a variety of types is really important. We know that housing is important to all types, but your ability to be stabilized there are certain things work better for certain folks, so I agree with you on that. We are working really hard to think about, to Commissioner Singleton's point, not county shelters or city shelters, but what are our community shelters and how do they all work together as one functioning system? And I think we're making some good progress there, so I'm excited to keep you all in the loop as those
And I
conversations.
appreciate the report was inclusive. Okay, sweet.
So one other piece I wanted to highlight from the memo, because we talked about behavioral health, but there's also something in the report around Chestnut Tree in particular, and there's some sort of closed loop referral system happening there as well. But then Chestnut Tree has these enormously great outcomes, and it's likely because people are screening into it based on their ability to either take over rent or whatever that looks like. So I will say, I'm not saying that function doesn't make sense, but I do think, again, having agency closed loop referral systems is not a system. And I think it's really important that we push to have, if that's working and we think it's effective and we need to keep it, then every female identified person in our shelter should have access to the same screening and tool to get in there. And so how do we really open it up so it's functioning more for the person? It shouldn't rely on the human being figuring out which is the right shelter for them. It should be that anybody in our system can access the places that have that either specialized care or that ability to really take that jump off point. And then one other thing I'll say is, I want to acknowledge out loud that the memo I put together and the recommendations around which shelters stay open is just solely based on the data that's received in this report. So that facilities assessment, a lens of geography, a lens of culturally specific services are all needed. And I think there's also shelters that we know are newer or are opening or are scheduled to open that weren't in this report that are important for us to keep because of that investment. So I just wanted to say that out loud. I know it's in the memo, but just so that we're all on the same page, that this is not the be-all, end-all. I am not saying we only should fund these shelters, but it is a starting point to get us past kind of the waiting for more data and how do we take those next steps forward. So again, want to appreciate and acknowledge that there's more work to do. So I know you all and your teams will be digging in even more as this moves forward.
So I've thought of one more thing, sorry. And this also fits into the sort of long-term, sort of the financial model and everything else. And this isn't, but it's also connected to the cities and primarily the city of Portland, just given the number of individuals in the city of Portland who are homeless, is how are we very deliberately connecting it to the city's housing strategy? So both the mayor and council have initiatives around affordable housing, different types of affordable housing, and how is all this connecting? Because I think, again, this is a place where we have some primary responsibilities in certain areas, but like they have a responsibility around housing. But the more that we can integrate it and let them know, like, here's what we're anticipating, or we think the flow through is, coming in these areas, and how they can best meet that is, I think will allow us to be better coordinated with the city and get better outcomes.
I would say the more we say that, the better. And we are, the city has a series of sort of focus groups around different aspects of homeless, like services and housing, and we are participating in those groups. We're participating in conversations around the unified housing strategy and how we make sure that we're connecting, can we connect to those affordable housing units? So we're in all those conversations. I think we're probably in a storming phase right now. We're getting into the forming as we move forward, but we are participating in those conversations.
Yeah, and I think the more that we can, as sort of the details or the framework becomes clear, like share that more broadly so that so that people have a sense of like that there is a long-term strategy and it's coordinated and it actually ends in housing. That I think that's a very positive thing for the community to see that there is this pathway that is being developed and it's being intentional, and I think that will give greater confidence in like all of our individual strategies that we're trying to execute.
All right.
Just wanted to make one more remark. We'll definitely get back to you all with follow-up on all the questions, but for anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to read the whole report, I do want to draw folks' attention to the last section before the appendix where we have some additional considerations. We talk about things like, those pathways to housing that are multi-stepped, where providers are, having a congregate to motel to housing kind of pathway. And then we also talk about, programs for target populations, including like culturally specific shelters, shelters for veterans, shelter for people with disabilities. So those things are all things we are also considering and didn't maybe have time to highlight as much today, but are part of the report and part of the consideration process in our planning. So.
Thank you. So I, again, just want to thank the really great discussion today, all the amazing information that is in the report. I mean, it is like 137 pages or something like that. So we've got some really good, overview information and really solid data. And then, the individual report outs on different shelters are also incredibly helpful. I know that this is going to be an ongoing conversation, both as we're thinking about the long-term plans for our homelessness response system, and all the connective pieces, behavioral health, housing, aging and disability services, and all the work that happens across different governments. But it's also going to be vitally important as we're thinking about the FY27 budget and the decisions that we have to make in a time of fewer resources. So having this data and having this information is really going to be really valuable. So appreciate all that. I will say I know that the city is having conversations around their system. This week I think the Housing and Homelessness Committee is hearing from the mayor about the overnight-only shelters. I know that Jillian is doing a lot of work with counselors about this report, and hopefully they will have a chance to have a similar discussion that we did today, because this is going to be very important. But again, thank you for this. Really appreciate the discussion. Thank you, Commissioners Moyer and Commissioner Singleton, for sponsoring this work session, and everyone at HSD. So with that, we are finished with our agenda today. The county is going to conduct a proclamation signing ceremony tomorrow, January 14th, from 12 to 1 p.m. in the boardroom. A quorum of Multnomah County Board of Commissioners will attend, and we hope you'll consider attending or tuning in virtually. There being no further business, we are adjourned.